I'm Jamie Buckland with the West Virginia FUE, West Virginia Families United for Education, and talking this morning with my friend Mike Donnelly from HSLDA. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in West Virginia?
Well, hey, Jamie, I love it. The few, the proud, the
Right.
homeschoolers and others of West
Yes.
Virginia. It's great. Thank you so much for having me on this morning. It's great to be with you. Hello, good morning, West Virginia. I am Mike Donnelly with HSLDA. I am privileged to be the West Virginia attorney for HSLDA members, and I live in West Virginia, so I'm one of you. Been in West Virginia, living in West Virginia for 16 years. Of course, some folks think that the Eastern Panhandle isn't really part of West Virginia, but shame on you. We think we are, so there. Anyway, uh, I'm a homeschool dad of 7. My wife Patty and I, we've been homeschooling for, well, our oldest will be 25, so you can do the math. So anyway, yeah, so Jamie, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, for families who may not be familiar with homeschooling, can you share some examples of how you have been a part of the expansion of homeschool freedoms and the protection? Because I've been homeschooling now for 15 years. So since I came on the scene, I've been familiar with your name and with HSLDA. And I would love for you to just kind of recap what it has looked like in the advocacy world for West Virginia.
Well, you bet, Jamie. Thank you so much. And thank you for your good work. You know, you have been such an advocate for many people who I know really appreciate you and your work. And we really are blessed in West Virginia to have such engaged people like yourself, along with 2 really strong state organizations, the Christian Home Educators of West Virginia and West Virginia Home Education Association, who are advocating for homeschooling. And it's just really a privilege for me to work with all of them. And so I've been working in West Virginia, specifically on West Virginia homeschool ever since I've moved to West Virginia. And we have really been pushing to improve the law in West Virginia in as many ways as we can to make homeschooling more accessible, more fair, more, you can use the word equitable if you want, you know, and easier for people, because parents should be able to choose the best kind of education for their kids, and they should not have to jump over all kinds of obstacles that are put in their way by state legislators who, you know, frankly, just want to control stuff, and education bureaucrats who just want to control people. Okay, so we've pushed really hard, and there's been a lot of work. West Virginia had one of the most regulated homeschool laws in the whole country until 2003, and even then it was still among the most regulated. But in 2003, the good work of people like John Kerry and Chuve and others changed the law, because it used to be in West Virginia you had to have 4 more years of education than the student you were teaching, which just doesn't make any sense. Okay, because we know that there's no correlation between how good a homeschooled student does and how much education or certification or training a parent has, or even a teacher for that matter. About 10 years later, we worked really hard with Senator Carnes in the legislature, and Brian Kerchaba, who was a delegate. Senator Carnes was, you know, homeschool dad also, so is Delegate Kerchaba, to push what we call the Modernization Act, the Homeschool Modernization Act, which made some really important changes to the law. For one thing, it got rid of the 50th percentile requirement, that you had to get that much on your standardized tests in order to make acceptable academic progress. We changed that to the 4th stay-9, which is essentially the 23rd percentile and above, which is much fairer because that's the average range of performance on standardized tests. We changed the law to be a one-time notice requirement. Those are kind of the 2 big things, and tweaked it in a few other ways to protect the rights of families to homeschool and not be hassled by truancy officers and attendance directors. Later on down the road, Jamie, you probably you know, we're paying attention at this point. Driver's license, we improved that so that parents could sign a letter so their kids could get a driver's license. We passed a diploma of fairness bill, 18812, which recognizes homeschool diplomas as basically the same as any other form of education. And you know, we've done other things too, Jamie. We've worked to develop relationships with the State Department of Education, with attendance directors and superintendents, to help them understand homeschool law, but also to intervene when they are overstepping. And I've got some really good relationships with some superintendents and attendance directors in West Virginia that have worked really hard to develop, and I appreciate the work they're doing. Some of them aren't too convinced about homeschooling. They have their own views. A lot of them don't like homeschooling because they think it takes away from public education. That's fine, whatever. They can have their ideas. But what we know and what we're always going to advocate for is for the rights of homeschoolers, to protect your rights and to make sure that nobody messes with them. So there. How's that?
That's great. That's perfect. When I kind of got started in this in 2019, the homeschool support group Reach here in Southern West Virginia, they asked me to be the legislative liaison, and the first thing that I did was reach out to John Kerry. So I love that you are bringing them into this conversation, because it really has. I feel like I am standing on the shoulders of these giants that have been at this for all of these years, and my family has directly benefited because, as you know, I have no higher education. So I have my high school diploma. So when I started homeschooling in 2007, we were just a few years removed from that change in the law. So granted, I had younger children, but still looking back at that, the work of so many has benefited directly my family. So that brings us up to this next point, because I like to say that HSLDA, CHU, WVHEA, you guys work to expand and protect homeschool freedoms. And so how does that align with the expansion of school choice? Can we do that in a way where we see growth, and we see improvement, but it doesn't come at the cost of the homeschool expansion of freedom? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's a great question, Jamie. And yes, Reach John Kerry and his wife Edie, who sadly passed away in January, and you can certainly pray for the Kerry family. They were instrumental in starting Reach, and John and Edie have been instrumental in supporting the growth of freedom in homeschooling in West Virginia. But homeschooling is the ultimate school choice, and as homeschoolers, I think we always have to be supportive of families having as many options available to them as possible to obtain the very best education for their children. At the end of the day, you, the parent, we are going to answer to God for our choices. And so ultimately, because we have that responsibility, we need to have that authority. And we also need to respect the decisions of other parents to make decisions that are best for their families. So I don't see any kind of competition or tension between homeschooling and school choice. When parents have choices, kids thrive. It's good for kids. For example, and in West Virginia, we've seen, what people call school choice, and there's so many things in the school choice, universe, if you will. It's not just ESAs, although West Virginia passed the Hope Scholarship a couple of years ago. That's an ESA program. And this year they passed a learning pod and micro school bill, which is pretty incredible, unlocking new vistas, which I think is going to unlock the creativity of West Virginians to try lots of new and different things when it comes to educating their kids. And I tell you what, Jamie, we in West Virginia, we can feel proud of the work that our legislature is doing in this area, because West Virginia is leading the country in creating new options for parents to be able to choose the best education for their kids.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that I get to be a part of making sure parents understand those options. So I know you have been working on, I saw you this weekend. We were at a conference this weekend, and I saw you with your printed out paper of Senate Bill 268 of the Learning Pod Micro School bill. So I have a feeling it's been your friend. Yeah, it's there. So I saw you equipped with that. Can you just talk a little bit more about Learning Pod? Is there anything you want to touch on with that? What should we know when we're talking about the Learning Pod Micro School bill?
This is such an interesting piece of legislation. It's really among the first in the country. And so, I mean, first of all, it's a new exemption, just like the Hope Scholarship is its own exemption. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's exemption N, and this legislation created two new things called learning pods and micro schools, and they're different. How are they different? What makes them different? What does it mean to be in a learning pod? What do you have to do to be in a learning pod? What does a micro school or a learning pod need to do to exist? Well, you can go and read Senate Bill 268, which is now the law because Governor Justice signed it. It's 1881 exemption M. I'm sorry, N is in Nancy, M is the Hope Scholarship, and you'll see some interesting stuff in there because they copied a lot of the homeschool law and put it in there. So it'll be very familiar to a lot of homeschoolers, but it's different at the same time. So it's very interesting. I am working on a memo that we'll be publishing for people who are curious about what does it mean to be a learning pod, what does it mean to be a homeschool family or a family who was a homeschooler and now is a learning pod, and does that the same thing as homeschooling? And I don't. It's not the same thing because the law says explicitly that it says here in Section 9, making learning pods and micro schools subject to the home instruction provisions and requirements does not make learning pods and micro schools the same as homeschooling. It also says that when you participate in a learning pod, that's an alternative to a public, private homeschool or micro school. And the same thing for micro school. It's an alternative to a learning pod, public school, private school. So these are all different things. The legislature says, nope, we're going to give everybody options. We're going to allow you to have creativity, use creativity, try different things. And so that's what this law does. So if you want to learn more about it, stay tuned. Check our website at hslda.org/WV. I'm hoping to get the memo posted in the next couple weeks for folks to be able to read and understand.
That'll be great. What I love that you continue to do and you've done for in this time that I've known you is direct us back to the law and educate us, because sometimes I hear from folks, they'll say, Jamie, you're getting in the weeds again, but I tend to live in the weeds. That's where I feel like that, in the details. And so I love that you're directing us back to the law and equipping us with a resource that will help us to do that. I tell people all the time, when I first started homeschooling and realized that homeschoolers did not have sport access to the WVSSAC, I tagged you down in the hall at a homeschool day at the Capitol, and I had been hearing numerous different reasons to why we didn't have access and numerous different ways people thought we could gain access. And you told me to go directly in the code, what the issue was, why we didn't have it, explained HSLDA's position to be neutral on it at that time. And that moment of equipping me to go to the law really was a catalyst in turning me towards being a liaison and going to the code. So I just appreciate that. And I wanted to make mention of that. So my next question is, what's the big deal? Why shouldn't we call ESA families homeschoolers? Why are Hope Scholarship ESA families not homeschoolers?
Well, as I just pointed out a little while ago, it's a separate exemption under the compulsory attendance law, which is West Virginia Code 1881. So, I think it's really important for us as citizens, especially as people who are homeschoolers or who are doing different options for education, to understand the law. And, the law should not be difficult to understand. And frankly, it's not that difficult in West Virginia. So, I encourage folks to just go online, Google West Virginia Code 1881, and just read it. Homeschooling is exemption C. 1881C. It's home instruction, but we call it homeschooling. That's the way we've homeschooled for decades and decades in West Virginia. That's exemption C. And there's actually two options under exemption C. I won't go into that right now. If you want to know more about it, go read it, or you can go to hslda.org/WV, and I got a little video there that will explain it. But then if you move on down the line to exemption N is in Nancy, which was added, and that that should tell you there's a whole bunch of stuff between A and N. There's a lot of exemptions in the compulsory attendance law, but N was the Hope Scholarship. And that was something that I thought was really important. And I worked really hard with the legislators in Charleston to put that in as a separate exemption. Didn't have to be that way, but we as HSLDA felt it was really important to preserve the homeschooling option as a separate option because Hope Scholarship is government funding, and we in the homeschool community are a little bit concerned that Well, the saying goes, with government shekels come government shackles, right? With government coin comes government control. And so we just wanted to make sure that there was no possibility for confusion or for the government shekels to bring government shackles into homeschooling if homeschoolers were homeschooling and getting the Hope Scholarship. So we thought it would be really good to have it just a clear, distinct option. And they agreed with us. And West Virginia is not the only state that has done this. Other states have been doing this, and I think it's really important. It creates clarity because under the Hope Scholarship law, people who are approved for the scholarship and do not want to enroll in a private school under exemption B or K, which are the two kinds of private schools in West Virginia, those are other exemptions as well, they can do what's called an independent instructional program. And that's different from homeschooling a couple of ways. Number one, although Hope schoolers versus homeschoolers, Hope schoolers with an IIP do have to assess their children annually, just like homeschoolers, they must also submit the results of that assessment on an annual basis in order to continue to be eligible for the Hope Scholarship. The second important distinction, which is very interesting, and you mentioned before, Jamie, that you have a high school diploma, but you haven't gone to law school yet, which I'm wondering when you're going to go to law school. I think you might be a great lawyer. Uh, but there's a difference between homeschooling and Hope schooling in terms of the qualifications of parents who are able to administer an IIP versus a home instruction program. You don't need to have a high school diploma explicitly, as I understand it, under the Hope Scholarship law, but you do under the homeschool law. So homeschool parents whose kids are home instructed or homeschooled, they or the people who are providing the instruction have to submit evidence of a high school diploma to the superintendent. It's different under a Hope Scholarship program. So those are a couple of two important distinctions between the two things. And I think if something is different, Jamie, we need to call it what it is, right? It's an independent instruction program under the Hope Scholarship program under exemption N. It's a homeschool program or home instruction program under exemption C, 1 or 2. And, this is not too hard for us, I think, as West Virginians or anyone. Let's call things what they actually are, instead of trying to confuse the lines. And that clarity will help people understand that there are differences that are important.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I like to tell people, I've got a daughter who's going into 5th grade. She's under homeschool exemption C, home instruction. And then I have my little guy who's coming up into kindergarten. He's going to be under that Hope Scholarship exemption, M as in Mary, under the IIP. And will they look different? Will they have different tent cards at the kitchen table that says exemption C, exemption M? No, it's going to look a lot.
You put a little different. You could put a hat on them or something.
We'll put hats on them, yes, but it's going to look similar. But there are distinctions that I do think are important, and why I've been so intentional about the language is that I don't want to see a Hope scholar lose their scholarship because they think they only have to submit that assessment 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th. I also don't want to see a student athlete under exemption C who has SSAC access, as we know, which was very important to me. I don't want to see them lose their athletic eligibility as a Hope scholarship under that IIP because as of right now, they don't have a pathway to SSAC eligibility. So that leads us to the next question. What are some reasons you think a family will choose to stick with homeschooling over the Hope Scholarship?
Well, I think you just pointed out a couple right there. For folks who want to make sure there's a clear path to participating in public school sports or whatever the sports are, that's one because right now it's not clear. And I think you can probably answer the question better than me because this is not an area where I am an expert in terms of sports access. But that's one reason I'm sure some people will want to stay with homeschooling versus Hope schooling. I think others are, they're just comfortable with what they've been doing and don't feel like they want to do anything different. There are some unknowns. These are some new regulations. So not everybody likes to just kind of jump ship. For those who are looking to do the IIP under the Hope Scholarship program, there is a question about availability of curriculum. Curriculum providers have to be approved by the treasurer as an education service provider. And right now there is some limitations because not all the vast, massive quantity of homeschool curriculums have jumped into West Virginia and gotten approved by the treasurer. I'm sure over time that will change, and more people will come in as this becomes clear, and the rules and experiences are understood. Um, Another important reason is that the eligibility requirement demands that a child has to have been enrolled in the public school for at least 45 days until the application is approved, which might be a little bit longer, although it seems like the treasurer is approving these things pretty quickly right now. So many kids are just simply not eligible, and they're not able to get the Hope Scholarship program, even if they wanted to. Some people have said, well, I'm going to re-enroll my kids for 45 days so they can qualify, and then I'll pull them out. In theory, you can do that. I think some people don't want to do that because, they're homeschooling for a reason, and they don't want to put their kids back into public school just so they can get, the Hope Scholarship program. Now that's going to change in a few years potentially, because the legislature built in a provision that if certain criteria are met, then the requirement for public school attendance will be changed. Although it seems like there's quite a bit of demand for the program right now, with lots and lots of people who are signing up.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. People ask me, Jamie, what do you think? Will we hit that, what we expect to be around the 12,000 mark? And what I say is, well, it depends on our ability to build this non-public infrastructure in the state of West Virginia. Where are those 12,000 Hope Scholars going to be educated? Because we only have roughly 140 private schools in the state. We have 9 counties that don't even offer a private school out of 55. And so do we have the supply for the demand that we would even see? And so I love those distinctions. I think that that's great. I do think that those of us under Exemption C are seeing right now what I like to say is, you mentioned earlier the shackles. When someone says, oh, but strings are attached, I like to say, well, a string could be a rope to you and it could be a thread to someone else. Like, we have to look at this. Some people may be prepared to jump through those hoops. Some may not. We did have a family that is part of the West Virginia FUE that went to the Great Homeschool Convention here a couple of weeks ago, and we equipped them with flyers for the Hope Scholarship Program to take through that massive vendor hall, which you're familiar with what a vendor hall looks like for GHC. But we're doing our best here to make sure that providers know. But you're right, in this initial year, there are only so many organizations or curriculum providers that are going to be signed up. So for many people who are used to the freedom of homeschooling, which is the true freedom, then they're going to be a little frustrated with these hoops and trying to make sure that they get the curriculum they want approved. So lastly, what would you say to Hope families who feel our refusal to call it homeschooling is unnecessary or exclusive? Because I'm getting a little bit of that. I'm trying not to be cantankerous here, but I think there are reasons, and I think you've spoke a little bit to this, but just in closing, what can we do to make sure that our intentional refusal to call it that is in good spirits and is not being divisive?
Well, Jamie, I want to thank you again for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak to your audience, and hopefully a lot of other folks will tune in after the fact when you post this on YouTube to listen, because I think we've had a really productive and helpful conversation. I think I've explained why it is necessary to maintain this distinction. It's not a semantic distinction, even though the people will be doing what looks like homeschooling. And if they want to call it homeschooling or schooling at home under the Hope Scholarship IIP option, fine, whatever. But from a legal perspective, I think we've touched on a lot of the reasons why it's important to maintain those differences so that people don't get confused. Unfortunately, we have changed the law, or fortunately, rather, we've changed the law so much in West Virginia. I've seen a lot of confusion where some school districts and even homeschoolers still think they got to submit their notice of intent every year. And we changed this like 7 years ago. One-time notice, people. Some people still submit their assessments every year. We changed that 7 years ago, folks, 3, 5, 8, and 11. I don't think we should have to submit them at all. Okay, that was the original proposal. The legislature, they're afraid of freedom, apparently. They think that, they don't want to trust you or me, the people of West Virginia. They don't want to give us the same freedom that people who live in Kentucky or Tennessee or North Carolina or South Carolina or Texas or California, even, if you can imagine that, the same kind of freedom that people in California have. They just submit one notice once a year and they don't have to do anything else. Why should we in West Virginia have to do so much more? But that's a tangent. Sorry. Uh, anyway, so I think it's important that we maintain this definitional distinction to make sure that people understand that there is a difference. We got to make sure that our public school officials, who they're trying to run their public schools, and we're out here creating chaos. And they're like, whoa, I don't get all this stuff. We need to make sure that we're speaking the right language so they get it, so that when they get a notice of intent for a micro school or a learning pod or a homeschool program or a homeschool program, they're going to be like, okay, I get it. These are different things and they do different things and there are different requirements. We've got to help our citizens. We've got to help our society, our culture, understand that these are different things. And so if it's different, we should call it something different. It's not about exclusivity. We believe that every parent is the one who makes that decision for their child within the range of legal options that are available to them. And we're going to support that. We're going to support parents making those choices, and we're going to respect parents making those choices. And I am super excited for West Virginia because West Virginia is going from the last to the first when it comes to unlocking the creativity and potential for all kinds of new and different educational options and opportunities for kids. And, our state has been a bottom dweller forever when it comes to performance and achievement. And I believe that this creativity over the next 5 to 10 years is going to move the needle on the opportunities, the educational achievement of the kids of West Virginia. That's going to be good for our state. And it's going to be good for our country, because as that happens, it's going to show people that we can trust our fellow citizens. We can trust parents. We don't have to put all kinds of handcuffs and regulations on them in any kind of educational activity that they're doing. And that's going to be good for kids in our country. So, Jamie, thank you again for hosting this conversation this morning.
Absolutely. Real quickly in closing, I want to run through just an educational moment and give Mike the opportunity to correct me if I get it wrong. But this is what I tell people: that compulsory education law and exemptions that you can find in 18-8(1), right? That's where they can go to find that. You can satisfy compulsory attendance through public school and now through charter school. If you're looking to get out of compulsory attendance, there are a number of exemptions. We're not going to highlight all of them. Exemption B is where a school has an agreement with their county. Exemption K is where a school is registered with the state. Exemption C is for home instruction. Exemption M as in Mary is the Hope Scholarship, which you can then use those dollars to go enroll in a participating school or to do that IIP that looks like homeschooling. And then exemption N as in Nancy is the learning pod or micro school option exemption. So those are the ways you can satisfy compulsory attendance, and some of the ways, not exhaustive, that you can have an exemption from compulsory attendance. So that's just a recap on what we've been talking. Mike, thank you so much for doing this. We are going to make sure that it's widely distributed, because I think this is an opportunity for the citizens of West Virginia to be engaged with the law. And as you said, it's not that hard. I think that West Virginia parents can do this. I think they're equipped to, and I appreciate your work in helping us do that. So thanks so much for talking with us, and I hope you have a great Monday, Mike.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And I just want to say one last thing here. West Virginia, we have two important mottos. One is wild and wonderful, and it's getting wild and wonderful in the area of education. And the other one is Montanae Semper Liberi, Mountaineers always free. So we're going to keep things free, and getting wild and wonderful, I think, is one of the ways we could do that. So thanks, Jamie.
That's right. And I love that the West Virginia FUE gets to team up and be a part of doing this with other organizations that have been working so hard. So thanks so much. I'm sure I'll be talking to you soon.